Good morning, everybody, and welcome again to the Super Sunday Supplement, where we will be ruminating over the discourse that Adam Lawrence puts out at 5:30 every Sunday morning, which this week is on interest rates and other fund banking and economic structures, which will have an impact on your property investment strategy and progress as you journey on the next 10 years, I imagine. We are also experiencing a rather negative loss today. We don't have the lovely Helen Chorley, which means you're now looking at three rather balding, greying, old, slightly chubby men, which is less attractive than obviously the light and the shine that Helen brings to any situation, and her sense of humour, of course. But we do have positives. We've got Mr. Adam Lawrence here for the brains that Helen normally brings. Mr. Ross Harper for the sense of humor that Helen normally brings, the Polishness that Helen tries to embody from her friend Carolina that Piotr brings, and just my sarcasm that Helen sometimes likes rather than embodies herself. So we are hoping that we are not as lessened as we should be by her lack of involvement today, but hopefully she'll be back with us next week. We're going to have a little bit of a chit chat about property in general. We will be going off on tangents. That's our speciality. So because Mr. Adam Lawrence today has kicked off the morning with such a heavy discourse, we think we'd let you do the cliff notes as we come to enjoy it.
We always like a quick synopsis, don't we, Jay? I note there that nobody got to embody Helen's good looks. Was there any reason for that, mate, at all? Or no,
just the obvious reason, really. I mean,
we haven't got that bit covered between the four of us, even added together, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah,
fair.
Yeah.
Fair. Okay. So yeah, I thought it was important this week to really drill down, and also had a bit of feedback around just explaining some of the concepts behind the economic machinery, if you like, a little bit more. And I think for those who've seen Ray Dalio's video on how the economic machine works, it really is honestly one of the seminal economics educational pieces of modern times. If you haven't seen it, we must find the YouTube link and pop it in the comments on the video.
I watched that video. I'll find the link and I'll drop it in the comments.
Thanks, Piotr. It's a great piece of work. And, Buffett always says that economists never make any money or whatever, but I genuinely consider Dalio to be one of the primary economic thinkers of our generation. He doesn't get badged as such, but his broad level understanding and also the work that he's put into trying to disseminate that down and make it understandable, it really inspires me. So I'm not saying I'm the next Dalio by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm taking my props from him from here on in. So it was quite a big deal this week when the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee met, because there was about as close as anybody ever comes to a bit of a shock and a bit of an admission of a mistake, I suppose, really, if you read between the lines. So the committee voted 5-4 to put the base rate of interest up from 0.25 to 0.5. In and of itself, not particularly scary, but it's the direction of travel that everyone's always interested in. And anybody who's in trouble when the base rate hits like 1.5 was always going to get themselves in trouble somewhere along the line anyway, So, but expectations have shifted quite considerably. The market's now thinking we'll hit close to 1.5% by the middle of next year. That's a fairly sharp shift upwards. And also, there's that feeling that the bank could do something relatively unexpected. There'll be odds on to put the rate up at the next meeting. Obviously, at this point, with 4 out of the 9 committee members having voted to do a bigger hike of 0.5% rather than 1/4. That's obviously a statement of intent. They don't expect, and it's near mathematical impossibility for inflation to start coming down until we hit this peak that's going to be represented by the energy price hikes that we now all know that we're dealing with, which also reared its head in today's efforts, because 54% on energy is significant. Now, this is one of those times when I'd encourage people to think absolute numbers as well as relative numbers, because we have for many years been one of the cheapest countries in Europe in terms of our energy supplies, which makes limited sense because we're not particularly well placed. We're very furthest away from where we get our gas from, which is very topical at the moment. Not particularly great for generating renewables necessarily. We've got some wind, but that's very variable when it's onshore. It's pretty good when it's offshore. But from a solar perspective, obviously Southern Europe would have a fairly significant advantage over what we can do. So a bit of a shock upwards, a bit of a shot in the arm. I read a tiny admission of maybe they've been a bit slow and maybe made a couple of mistakes here. I don't think you'll see the central bankers come out and say that, obviously. That wouldn't happen. There's a bit of politics involved in all of that, of course. But the direction is upwards. The bond yields are moving upwards. And so I tried to put a bit of that into context by saying, well, the bond yields are moving, but they're moving to the 5 years of 1.3%, the 10 years of 1.4%, the 50 years of 1.25%. So direction of travel upwards. Actual numbers shouldn't be worrying anybody at all. And the message behind all of that is ultimately the market still believes in the very long run, when we look across our lifetimes, effectively, that 1.25% is still a fairly good reward for government debt over that long period of time. So we're not shifting out of the low rate deflationary environment that's brought about by lots of different things, but tech has been a big part of that. Obviously, what we can do on our phones these days compared to what we could do 10 years ago, how much processing power we have in our pockets, how many efficiencies there are, and obviously the big efficiencies that we can see at the moment. Well, working from home is potentially one of them, but I'm on the fence waiting for more data on that one. Electric cars, etc., they will bring those bonuses forward, but there's still a drastic under discussion of productivity for me. But the bank this month have focused on inflation. Now, this isn't the sort of inflation you can really control with interest rates, so it's a bit more being seen to be doing the most that they can with the tools they've got available than really being effective. But I still support what they've done. And I'm sure if I was on the MPC, which is probably a bit too much of a lofty ambition given what I've spent the last 43 years of my life doing, but if I was ever on the MPC, I might have a conflict of interest or two to declare. That would probably be the main problem. I think the rate should go down. Every month they should just go down.
I've got some questions.
Okay.
So I'm curious about, obviously, we focus on UK and US and the banks raising interest, but the European banks, the European Central Bank kept the interest normal. And I'm just wondering how this all impacts everything else, because obviously when the interest is high in the UK, then people would be buying more bonds and stuff in the UK, right? So then the pound price would go up because more people want pound. But actually the pound price went down, even though 2 days ago the two banks make different decisions as to interest rates. How do you explain?
Now that's a really, really great point, Piotr, and I'd probably like to answer that in two sections. So apologies for everyone else who's going to have to wait another 10 minutes before they speak. But the first section would be a general point around when markets do things that you would not expect them to do in reaction to news. That in itself is newsworthy, and that is worth taking note of. So that's telling you that the market either sees problems ahead in the UK faster than in the Eurozone, which I could understand, or they feel that the four people on the MPC perhaps needed to win the vote rather than lose it, and we should have hiked further. What I find interesting at a high level is 5.4% inflation in the UK, which is our official number. We'll stick with that for the moment. And I think 5.1 the Eurozone are on at the moment. 5.1 in the Eurozone is much more significant than the 5.4 in the UK. The UK has this trailing, slightly higher inflation, which has served it well over the last several years, some of which is to do with being the world's reserve currency, 100 years ago, and an ongoing depreciation, a very, very long-term rotation out of sterling, which gives us more inflation. The Eurozone has had many more deflationary problems than we've had in the UK over the last decade or so. There's been some points which they're very, very keen to avoid disinflation or deflation, because it's much more damaging. Because apart from anything else, the primary point is people start putting off purchasing and consumption because they think, well, hold on, that's going to get cheaper next year. So in a way, an extended version of what was happening with some of the commodities last year, there were people saying, well, we'll wait for our wood, we'll wait for this new fence, we'll wait for the other. And then the economic concept of substitution also comes in. So, bloody hell, wood's so expensive, we might as well make our fence panels out of gold these days or something. Or in seriousness, we might look at composite materials for fencing. We might look at different solutions. We might look at metal studs rather than timber studs become more attractive for a variety of reasons as an example of substitution. So it is a message in there, and there is something to watch. I don't understand why the health of the Eurozone would look particularly better than the health of the UK at this time. But I did talk a little bit today at the end how the Bank of England kind of, again, you get used to looking for the coded messages, because, of course, they have to be very, very careful about what they say. And there will be hundreds of people scrutinising line by line, word by word. If you say and instead of or, that could be massively, massively significant. So they do need to be careful, but they also present the facts as they see them. So at the end, they presented their models of, okay, so if the market is correct about the direction of interest rates, and if the market is correct about the direction of energy prices, which everybody will be pleased to hear is downwards from here, not upwards, at the point of now, of course, the wholesale price is not the only fruit in terms of how the prices are made up, but it is an important part, of course. Then we go into 2024 and 2025, which is the bank doesn't like to go more than about 3 years further forward. And we go into an environment of 5% unemployment and about 1% GDP growth. Now, both of those are fairly problematic for the government, not in and of themselves necessarily. GDP at 1% growth is not good. It's not a good advert for the capitalist model. It's not a good rate of return. What's the point of having all this debt and investing it in infrastructure if you can't generate GDP growth above 1%? It doesn't say good things about the administration. Now, the reality is there's a huge drag from all the debt that they've taken on. Of course there is, and that filters into that. But, you're getting into nuanced arguments that voters aren't going to really want to hear, take the time to understand, etc., etc. They're going to hear 1% growth. So it takes 70 years for us to double our living standards. Not good, especially on the back of a decade in the 2010s where we didn't actually materially improve our living standards, and lots of people are worse off in real terms. This is long-term pain that, in honesty, if we'd had this sort of conversation in 2010, we would have been saying then it's going to take a long time to get over the financial crisis. And history tells us, it takes 20 years-ish to get over these massive events like the Great Depression, like World War II. And then what you've had within that 20-year period is you've had a pandemic, which has then forced a lot of other things to happen. So you've got a bit of a double bubble. 11 years, 12 years stretch, but not really enough to come back to full health. So that's significant. And the unemployment thing, 5%, 6-7 years ago, totally palatable, very much below the long-term post-World War II average for unemployment. 6% was Mark Carney's number when he was the governor of the bank. He wanted to be below 6, and then he saw us as being very healthy. But you've got to understand the nuances. If you're at 4 today, which is roughly at 4 today, and you move to 5 over the course of a few years, number one, you're giving the opposition a lot of rope to hang you with, realistically. Number two, people think in terms of trends. They don't necessarily think in terms of absolute numbers. So what the bank's saying is, right, growth is heading down from this point, and it's going down to below where we were in the 2010s, which, as we've said already, pretty uninspiring decade for most households in aggregate. Not a lot of progress was made, apart from in the very higher echelons of those who had lots of assets, who saw a lot of asset inflation. thanks to quantitative easing and stuff like that. Oh, and now, I mean, you go from 4 to 5%, you've got 25% more unemployed people. That's ultimately how the maths works. So the direction of travel looks bad. And when you think we surely nailed on for a May, June 24 election, I mean, the Conservatives aren't going to want to pull one now, regardless of whether they keep Boris or not, right? And if Boris is going to stay and he's going to need time to regroup, the betting markets are saying about 2/3 probability he goes this year, 1/3 probability he stays, which feels about fair. You could see either outcome occurring. It's not going to be easy to dislodge him, but obviously every day we're hearing, XYZ MP of Timbuktu, who we've never heard of, has submitted a letter to the 1922 committee and thought, well, that hasn't really changed my day, but thanks for letting me know, but they're working towards their 52 letters, is it, or 55 letters that need to be handed to Sir Graham Grady. So there's lots of interesting stuff going on, but my reading of that subtext at the end to the bank is, there you go, Rishi. Doesn't look great. What are you going to do about it? And obviously, some of that depends on which hat he's wearing and whether he's moving down the road, one door down from 11 to 10, which comes back to what we were just saying. But it's, and I think it's quite fair because the central bank is limited in what it can actually do. And if you look at its role over the last 10 years, you could argue that their most important role, and that's primarily because monetary policy, the interest rate specifically, has been such a redundant tool because it's just been squashed into the ground. Their most important role has been calming people down and keeping people cool. And look, if you remember the day after the referendum, people are running around like headless chickens. Mark Carney came out and said, right, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is how we're doing it. And suddenly the markets just calmed down from this going on to, okay, we accept. Doesn't look economically good, but it's happened. Now there's going to be a period of flux, which obviously there was for four and a bit years, followed by another period of flux as we go through the longer term machinations of something like Brexit. So, which is obviously still having impact, but then you have to now argue with people over whether that's Brexit's fault, COVID's fault, Boris Johnson's fault, or perhaps just variance and randomness that we can't always control, and the truth, like always, is there's a mixture of those things that play a part. So there's the cliff notes in about as long as it took me to read the whole supplement out anyway. But the real point is to try and offer some words of calm, a bit like the central bank, really. We shouldn't really be worrying too much. We've still got probably 6 months before we see the little package lenders and stuff go back to the 3.5%, 3.75% that we've been more used to over the last few years for a 5-year fix. You're still fixing stuff at 3% on Monday if you want to go and get your mortgage applications in. Little point around those who are trying to transfer DB pension schemes, because the reason why they've had these hugely overinflated values is because of these low bond yields. With bond yields on the sort of permanent rise now from that, your transfer values are going to start to get eroded. So it's hard enough to do those transfers anyway, but if you're on it, do not delay any further and just get on it on Monday, because it's the time to fix low, and it's the time to get those DB transfers done if that's what you want to do. And I think, we'll have to see how quick this roller coaster wants to go. I see it like a roller coaster, and there's being some upside. I still think there might be some downside even before the end of the year. And I just don't see a smooth hike path. Another 4 hikes without incident in the economy. I see no chance of that. And this is why I see very little chance of, I think the average private sector forecast is 4.7% on GDP this year. I think we're going to miss that by at least 1%, maybe 1.5%. I'm right at the bearish end of that, and I think we might put in about a 3%, thanks to COVID rebounding. But I think you're going to see enough reasons for people to go, we might still just want to be a bit cautious here and not let the consumption gates loose and hammer the credit cards again quite yet.
Interesting. Lots of things to consider, huh?
Yeah.
20 minutes of genius, Adam.
Yeah.
You want that now, or that was? Sorry.
That was 20 minutes. Absolutely brilliant. So can I ask a question? If Boris goes, who replaces him?
Well, Betting markets are saying Sunak, Liz Truss second favourite. Truss would be popular with the right-hand side of the Conservative Party, 1922 committee darling. But Rishi is fairly austerity-minded himself. So overall, I would see either of them being bad news for economic performance, because I don't like to give Boris too much credit, but some of the stuff he says actually does make some sense. And he also does quite a few right things for wrong reasons. And I never like to underestimate his intelligence, because he is actually a phenomenally intelligent man who obviously, I'm missing my PPE colleague today, as we've already referred to, but he did undertake the finest course at the finest university in the world. So that should be borne in mind. But yeah, I think Sunak has started to come out of hibernation, hasn't he? And you've seen some indications. There's obviously some polling going on. But it's a good question, Ross, because if you are MP number 631 from Timbuktu that none of us have heard of, what do you want? You want your seat at the next election, and you want the biggest winner that you've got. And rightly or wrongly, nobody looks like they can win an election like Boris. I heard 5 minutes of talk radio sound bites from people when they were still going on about Sue Gray and the Partygate stuff and everything else. And basically, these people were saying, look, just get on with it. Yeah, we've got the memo, right? Yeah, they did this stuff. We don't trust any. We've also heard Starmer did some stuff. We don't trust any of them anyway. He's got bigger fish to fry. He's the Prime Minister. Police are involved. Okay, just get on with it. And if there's quite a lot of parallels. It's really interesting to draw between the Trump administration and the Johnson administration, because they do have a similar world viewpoint, as in rules don't apply to me, mate, and I don't really care that much about tradition. Even though Johnson is a classicist by education, Jay, he doesn't care that much for tradition. And there is that element of, do you know what? If it comes to the crunch, it's a bit like you don't nuke the USA when you've got Donald Trump in charge, because it will be mutually. He will not hesitate to fire everything he's got at you and anything you're anything to do with. Whereas on the flip side, if you've got Jeremy Corbyn in charge, you'd have to think that someone like Putin would be eyeing you up, thinking, I'm pretty sure I can have you, mate. So I'm not sure what Putin thinks about Biden, but I think some of that's playing itself out as we speak in general. So Jeremy Hunt will be in the shaker as a dependent. It's a bit like if you're anything like me, when I was in my younger days and still dallying on the dating scene, if I went out with a very volatile character, I would find that my next one would tend to be a rather pedestrian, nice, quiet, philosophical character. And if you apply that to the governmental level, then after a Johnson, you might want a Hunt, really. But Jeremy Hunt versus Keir Starmer would be the biggest snooze fest you could ever imagine. It will turn people off in their droves. So I think you'd see low turnout. Whether that would favour the Conservatives, I don't really know. But I think it looks relatively uninspiring. There's reasons to doubt whether Sunak would be the right candidate, just in terms of the billionaire thing is not ideal for today's age. We're still the UK, we don't tend to clap people who've got Lamborghinis and Ferraris. We still tend to say things about them behind their back or whatever.
Or on the show.
Or on the show.
Yeah, but that's because they've leased them. That's not the same thing. But I don't think there's many inspiring. You're not seeing strength in depth on either side, and perhaps that's a permanent thing. I mean, but you go back. Where's your Ken Clarks? Where's your Michael Portillos? Where's these heavyweight? In 30 years' time, who of these people would be saying he or she was a proper heavyweight politician? I don't really know. And I'm only picking Conservatives. There are heavyweights on the Labour side, which I don't see being replaced by what's coming up through the ranks.
So that was so in fairness, that was kind of the purpose of the question, because it strikes me we don't have people who are ready to take the PM's position. There's no clear definitive person. I touched on it before that now I live in a slightly different country, or I live in a different country at the moment, and it's a completely different setup. It's kind of like one guy makes the rules and everybody follows them. So there's no choice, there's no discussion. But you're watching what goes on in British politics quite closely because I've got a bit more time now. There's nobody there. There's nobody that. So by default, it doesn't really matter what Boris says or does. The likelihood is probably by the time we come off this, he'll have resigned. But the likelihood is, or it strikes me that the likelihood is that he's going to be there because there is nobody else. It's that there doesn't seem anybody who can stick up their hand and say, look, I can settle the ship or settle the position, because there's not. They just don't exist just now.
Yeah, I think if you were going to make a bet, I think 2-1 he lasts the year out rather than 1-2 he doesn't is where the value is, without doubt.
Yeah.
I don't see it going in a resignation. Like this is the chap that is an equivalent of a gonorrhea infection. You're going to have to chuck some fairly large penicillin-based medications at him to even shift him for 5 minutes. It's like that kind of grease that you find at the back of a greasy spoon cafe, where they got the thing and they're scraping it off, and there'll still be tendrils of it left. It's just not going to happen. The guy has taken the whole idea of being Caesar and this war against COVID as being, a real thing. I'm expecting an Ides of March where everyone in the house starts going, it's like who here is Caesar? And Jason Rees-Mogg digs a dagger in.
Richer, are you thinking something like that? Yeah.
You know what? I don't think it would be Rishi. I think a snake like Rees-Mogg would probably do something like that. And you start to see if you ever watch like the question times and in Parliament, you're starting to see more and more Labour attacking Rishi, because he is actually the only real threat in terms of strength, because he actually comes up with. I mean, he's in a shit situation, but he comes up with, we'll make do and we'll try and progress on from this, which is the best you're going to come across. And actually, if you think back, the last real strength in terms of politicians that we saw that had depth that Ross was talking about was probably early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's kind of, the onslaught that Blair brought in, was it 12 years or something ridiculous like that he was around for? No, that really did weaken a lot of the well, on all sides. You saw what Labour did to the Liberal Democrats. Well, that went the way of the ghost. And then the only way to really get the Conservatives back in is you needed a chinless mug like what was his face?
Cameron,
the pig boy, that's it. Cameron to come in and even then when he left, it was a fucking bum fight amongst all of the other chinless, rhythmless, gormless, gimpless, feckless Muppets that were just delusional enough to raise their heads above the parapet of insecurity and incompetence to try and dive into it. And even then, Boris put his name on the mug of who would backstab who the quickest, fastest. And the thing that you said, sorry,
50p says Michael Gove. 50p on Gove.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But I mean, the point that you made, which is, I'm loath to underestimate his intelligence. Being a blithering, messy head fool that kind of comes up with
easy, mate. Easy.
Oh no, but you behave. But no. I mean, when it's all over here and it's not windy outside, there's a problem. It's you can't invoke that much Albert Einstein and be that much of a pillock at the same time. It's not addressable. But the reality is that he's actually really very intelligent, and that actually sets him apart from quite a lot of his contemporaries on the world stage, because we can sit and watch what goes on in Parliament and think, my God, what a bunch of absolute character assassinating, blithering, backwards and forwards, nothing gets achieved Muppets that we're dealing with. Then you look at the international stage and you think, oh well, it's not that bad.
Yeah, if you wanted to look at Justin Trudeau's CV, for example, you'd find a pretty uninspiring piece of toilet paper. Realistically, it is fair to say that, and that is a big difference between a Trump and a Boris to an extent. But then you've got the old Elon Musk point of the view of the world of like, doesn't matter if I didn't go to college because I just employ people who did. So there is an element of that probably needs to be injected into this. With I think 5 people have gone this week from relatively close aides and stuff from number 10. So it's you either position that as the rats leaving the sinking ship, or you do see there's people potentially, changing angle, changing career, changing support, losing confidence behind the scenes. So it doesn't look great. But I think if you looked up the Wikipedia definition of alligator blood, that's what flows through Johnson's veins. And I completely agree with your point. You're not when Thatcher said the lady's not for turning, right, the man's not for resigning in this instance. That is not happening. So it is kicking and screaming. It is, you've got to come for him. You better come in the middle of the night. And if Rees-Mogg comes on his own, you better bring some backup. Put it that way. You better bring some backup.
But where are the political heavyweights that you would see in the old days, the Gordon Browns of yesteryear, who were on the political scene and have great credit and were doing press conferences whilst not holding the top job at the time? We don't seem to have those people. The best economic output that comes out is probably Adam Lawrence on a Sunday. It's bizarre.
I'll let you know when the Treasury come knocking, Ross.
Or the tax man.
Well, we've got a couple of interesting comments, actually questions. It's first one from James for Adam, unsurprisingly. How tight is the relationship between general interest rates and long-term government bonds, 5-10 years, is traditionally? How has it been? 1.4% on 10 years bonds suggests we should not be worried about a big increase on borrowing costs anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point about the 50-year that I raised earlier and the 1.25%. If you looked at, you could choose points in time to segment sort of. We talk a lot about post-World War II. We talk a lot about pre-financial crisis, because that was significant in kind of just a huge gap down in rates in general across the board. Because you've got to remember what's happening there in an environment of financial repression. Savers are being punished and borrowers are being rewarded as long as they can get returns over and above the cost of their debt. And that's really what's happened sort of since 2008. So there's strong correlation is the direct answer to James's question, but not direct correlation in as much as, a move of 0.25% has moved the 10-year longs about 0.18, 0.2. So some, but there's also the interrelation between all of the lengths of time. And I talked a little bit about this today in the supplement, and the infamous inverted yield curve, where, for example, the 2-year bonds are offering better returns than the 5s and the 10s, which is a very reliable predictor of a recession or recessionary conditions. So that's also another good reason to watch the yield curves. But ultimately, remember that these 5s and 10s, that's how the mortgage debt, if you're buying your mortgages from a packager or from a challenger bank or whatever, these are this is their cost of capital, right? The 5s and the 10-year longs. So that's the rate that they've got to beat in order to attract the money, or provide equivalent security on. And that's how they securitize all their mortgages, lump them together and sell them off as income producing assets to the funds who want to buy them. So yeah, the expectation, again, James, it's probably the direction of travel that we need to focus on, as well as the absolute number, because it's how expectations are formed, and that will determine ultimately whether people put their hand in their pocket to spend money, whether they run up some of those bills on credit cards that they paid off during 2020 and some of 2021. Because for the economy to grow, if we don't have consumption growth, we have a significant difficulty, because the only other places we're going to get it from are investment, which has been relatively poor but stronger under Johnson, and government spending, again, stronger under a Johnson. If you see a Sunak or some similar come in, they're going to want to cut. They're going to want to boost investment. They'll do everything they can to do it. But he's kind of fired quite a few bullets already in that direction. And then government spending, if anything, he's going to want to cut it. And that, if you're looking at 1% GDP growth without austerity, what do you think you're looking at with austerity? You're looking at zero, or you're looking at a negative. So I'm not personally too worried about borrowing costs as it stands. I think in theory, if it did go up and up, let's say it went up every meeting until it was up at 2.5%, let's say, which is an unrealistic view of the world. But let's say that it did. Then ultimately, I think what you'd see some of the investment property potentially being sold off, or certainly not being bought. But I think you'd still see the more expensive houses, these bigger houses that people need more because of COVID, or want more because of COVID, will still continue increasing in price. I'm not personally seeing or hearing any more slack in that side of the market than in the hardest bits of 2021. Stuff still goes on and gets 14 bids within a day and goes to sealed bids and red carpets and whatever else you can roll out to try and buy it if you're unlucky enough to be trying to move up the chain at this time. So there's strong correlation, but it's not the be all and end all. And really, my point is, it's more relevant to watch the 5 and the 10 year longs than it is to watch the base rate, really, to be honest.
Makes sense. Another comment from Dominic. Would you agree that UK is considered very secure and stable, which drives investment from overseas investors, particularly in property, and significant interest in UK industrial property? And I would also add that quite often when there's things going on in the world, right? Like, I don't know, there were things going on in Greece at some point, then there's something else like in China, and then somewhere else in Hong Kong and in India, whatever. People tend to like go to London to buy things, or go to UK because they consider it super stable. So there's like international people from all over the world. When something happens, they come to London to put their money in a safe haven kind of thing. You still consider that?
I really like the multifaceted layers that are in Dominic's comments. So to go back to what Ross was saying earlier around the sort of more authoritarian regime in a UAE style situation, and in many ways, it's natural that authoritarian regimes have appealed a lot more in the last couple of years, because things have tended to need to be done at a governmental level that people don't like. People don't like the idea of a lockdown. The execution of them in the more liberal countries has been very, very poor indeed. And that's what's led to a lot of this stuff that's caused fuss on Joe Rogan and things like that, where ultimately...
And a lot of that is covered as well in that economic machine thing, right? The video of Dalio, like when he talks about how in certain times, basically, authoritarian regimes or like people in control seem more attractive.
Yeah, and China, with their more liberal economic side of the policy over the last 30 odd years, and more recently the Emirates, have still enjoyed very, very solid economic growth on the back of it, which has still pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty or relative poverty and into middle classes and things like that. So that's obviously an upside, which it's easier to do if you get those sort of things right. The downsides can be quite significant. And that's one of the reasons why London remains more attractive, because, we don't have some of those rules around what percentage of a company does what's the word I'm looking for? Not an expatriate, the opposite, but X% of your company needs to be owned by a natural resident in various tax havens, and there are rules in China and Dubai around that sort of stuff as well. Whereas in London, if you bring it over, you own it, you can buy it. You overseas investor, you can buy it. There might be a transaction cost, which actually internationally, even with the extra 2% we put on these days for that stuff, is still relatively low, because transaction costs tend to average between about 7 and 10% in Germany and a lot of Western Europe. So we're not vastly disproportionate to that. And of course, when you think about we were talking about the 50-year bond yield earlier. When you talk about long-term strategic advantages, UK rule of law, massive advantage. Internationally, globally respected legal system. The academic institutions at the highest level still have an excellent reputation. Whilst sterling isn't the world's reserve currency anymore, English is still the world's reserve language, and that looks fairly difficult to topple. Even if 1.5 billion people speak Mandarin or whatever, it's still going to be quite difficult to move that away from being the international language of business, apart from anything else. So lots and lots of structural, long-term advantages, and you would struggle to replicate because you can't really have effective human rights campaigners in China or Dubai or wherever. There's very little threat to that legal substance and the famous British legal system that gives people a lot of that confidence. So definitely secure and stable on that front. Definitely very well protected in terms of relationships with powerful neighbours like the US, like Germany, etc., considered on the right side of most of that stuff, and also reasonably difficult to attack being an island. So that helps. Political stability, two-party system effectively. So it ebbs and it flows. The only meaningful, we talked about Blair earlier, but there is a world in which Blair and Cameron are effectively the same person, although Jay only remembers one of their names, which is understandable. Slightly left of centre, slightly right of centre, and I'm not even sure which one I'm talking about when I say that. So there is a relative amount of stability around that side of things. And in terms of UK industrial, I'm not sure I can relate that to what I've just said, but it's fairly obvious that we're quite a long way ahead of the curve with convenience shopping. Things are moving from just having a Just Eat or whatever to actually someone can nip to the supermarket for me as well. Creating or helping along the gig economy does drive things forward, even if people don't always like the working conditions and the ways and means to do it. Just like anything else, there's times in all our lives where we'd have been willing to work 100 hours a week, and all right, we might not have been earning that much, but 100 hours we'd have been earning plenty. Thank you very much, and had no bloody time to spend it either. So we would have done very well, thank you. And some of that freedom is quite useful, I think. So really good comment, Dominic, and I don't know if anybody wants to add to any of that, particularly about industrial and stuff. They can do, certainly.
I think, go on, Ross.
I was just going to say on the overseas front, it's interesting being here and talking to people from different countries. I think the perception of London probably in line, everything you're saying is right, but the biggest thing for them is risk. There's no risk. They can lose the property in London, or there's limited risk of that happening. Whereas for a lot of these people, if they're coming out of Russia or China or these kind of places, everything they have in those areas at risk. So a pound in the UK is worth way more than a pound in Russia for them. So a unit in the UK, they're not as bothered as we are with capital growth or rental yields or whatever. It's more about having an asset that's secure. And both, and a lot of the overseas governments are quite happy for their nationals to buy in London because they see it as being a safe place as well. It's all about safety and security.
Yeah, and they want a stake in the UK pie, don't they?
Can we just acknowledge the fact that the first person to mention the R word on the
I
Sunday
was really
Live
aware of that.
was Mr. Ross Harper. He busted out the risk. We waited how long? 45 minutes. Helen wasn't here, and it was left to Ross. Wow. I mean,
Helen won't believe us unless she watches this.
So we can get on 43 minutes and 15 seconds. Ross used the R word.
Yeah.
And when Adam was finishing up there on his industrial knowledge, I was very aware I was going to use the R word as well. And I was thinking, is there any other way I can put this? But,
sorry, Adam, you're on a flow there. I just had that needed recognition.
Mate, you stop me anytime when you see something of that level of significance. Absolutely. But yeah, of course, it's a really good point. The old Warren Buffett return of investment rather than return on investment. And you look at China, and even Jack Ma isn't safe. So, billions and tens of billions don't cushion you from the long arm of the state and the one-party system. So that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And they also, I think, going back to whether the international governments are happy about that or not. I mean, China obviously has fairly stringent capital control policies, but then the UK, because of some of our history, because of the legal system, because of our time when we tried to take over the world as well. We've still got that relationship with Hong Kong, for example, which makes a lot of sense, which annoys China quite a lot, but it's never going to go away because it's historically there, and importing quite a lot of people from Hong Kong and offering them British nationalisation brings quite a lot of money into the country, brings quite a lot of skills into the country. It is exactly the sort of immigration policy that nobody argues with, really. And China, control. I think it was, last time I checked, it was about £40,000 worth or $40,000 worth, in theory, that you're allowed to get out of China every year. So it's very stringent on letting that capital flow internationally. But they don't mind, from a strategic perspective, their citizens and themselves owning UK government bonds, owning stakes in UK utilities, hospitals, public services. They're very keen in all of that because there's strategic importance to the UK. Because although it's not necessarily a global military power anymore, it is still a global diplomatic force, and it does still have some really worthwhile stuff going on. In terms of COVID, you can look at the all the work done on the vaccines and the genome sequencing and all the rest of it. We were right at the top table with the best people in the world. So that still shows a lot of importance and heavyweight power, I think. So flow over.
I think it's super interesting. You take you take the UK and you've made some brilliant points there. But I remember I was watching. I think someone sent me a video clip of the Turkish Parliament when it was in session. I don't speak Turkish. It's one of the very few languages I didn't bother to learn. Not because I don't
just
like
100 words or so, probably.
Yeah, possibly. But I mean, it's far too modern from its humble beginnings, so it doesn't really translate well for me. But it was, maybe the video was about 20 or 30 minutes long, and within 8 minutes, there were MP equivalents diving over their tables and physically fist fighting each other, which was brilliant, FYI. I mean, at one point, I was like, I want this guy to win. I was putting bets on who was going to knock out the other person, right? So, I mean, and there is an element to almost having the unbroken, and I don't know really what I mean by unbroken, but the unbroken kind of monetary policy and growth. Lloyd's of London dating back to like 14 whatever it was. Then you have the legal system, which dates back well before then. It beats Paris to death with its level of kind of, and how it's grown. Okay, it's complicated, it's messy, it's a bit like the Bible. Some bits contradict the other bits, but you just go with it because it kind of works in some way or another. And then obviously you've got how land ownership and how the society has grown. And I would argue, for a Western civilization, it has done exceedingly very well. You can look at how certain races and class of people feel comfort in parts of America, and you think, okay, well, they haven't progressed very far. You can look at the same in parts of Europe, which have been historically very particular about where you are in society, your level in society, your color or your religion, or your social economic background. That's been an issue, but that's improving. I think the UK is going some way to achieve something that's better. You almost have to go blind to some of the reasons why people voted for Brexit, but I don't think all of the people voted for Brexit for those xenophobic reasons. Well, at least my heart tells me that. I may not be 100% correct there, but and the two-party system. I'll tell you a story. When I worked for, it was a trust. It was asset management, family-backed. A good number of billions, I think like 24, 26 billion across all of the trustees and all the deeds and things like that. I think I was working with about 3.3 billion of that. We had a client who insisted that 40% of his wealth in whichever flavor he wanted to have that wealth, whether it was property, whether it was bonds, whether it was land, whether it was infrastructure, whatever it was, bloodstock, watches, cars, paintings, items of historical significance, whichever flavor he wanted it in, he wanted it to be held in principalities. So he liked the idea that it was kind of like Monaco or, other places like that. Essentially the UK, although it's a two-party system, is monarchy backed. So he liked the idea of having his wealth stored in areas that were monarchy backed. And I don't understand why. It's still to this day. I mean, I thought it was genius because he had quite a lot of stuff in Switzerland, which obviously isn't principality or monarchy based anymore, but historically was, and two-party system and how they kind of resolved to remain neutral in wars and things like that. I imagine there's some kind of value to that. And I think if you look at China before it bled red and deposed the dynasties, I imagine he probably would have wanted to store quite a lot of his wealth there, but maybe not anymore.
Well, yeah, in the 1500s, utter global superpower that then went through a very tumultuous 400 years or so, effectively. So there's certainly historical precedent for what he was saying. There's another good question here, Piotr, about blockchain from Charlie. Yeah. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because Jay just mentioned a very good point around the land registry in general. I remember someone saying to me in the Philippines, there's something like, I think it was the Philippines, 200 processes and forms and things to go through to change the ownership of a piece of land. And that's why a lot of people end up doing transactions without going through all of that. So there's incredible complexities that we can't understand in terms of just securing what you own and going with Ross's point around, why people potentially invest in the UK and things like that. So I think blockchain probably makes the transaction easier. Well, it certainly makes the transaction easier. It makes it more transparent, which sometimes is not the desire, especially at the particularly high levels. But you can still put Caymanian companies and all the rest of it behind all of that. There's a price to doing it, but it can be done. But in and of itself, the process, the blockchain process, doesn't necessarily make one or other place more attractive, I don't think, because it still comes back to where's the legal system, how much risk is there of the government taking your assets off you, and the stuff that we've already talked about. So I don't think in the near term that it will. I think you'd have to resolve a lot of these difficult processes in a lot of countries, and a lot of the transaction costs are there to keep the system going. But certainly in the UK, a lot of those transaction costs are being lifted out in tax by the government. So it's also not necessarily going to oil those wheels either. And of course, we still, even in 2022, we still live in a world where, even in some relatively forward-thinking Western European democracies, some money changes hands under the table in property transactions quite regularly. And it still goes on quite regularly. And when you go over to Asia, certainly from my experience of knowing quite a few people who've been involved in property transactions in India, they will openly talk to me about black and white money, openly. And so there's a huge amount of I remember seeing a statistic about Greece. Piotr mentioned Greece earlier. Before the 2015 debt crisis, they reckon about 25% of their GDP, or their GDP would go up by a figure of 25% if all cash transactions and non-off-market transactions were actually declared. So that's how significant the untaxed side, and that was a fairly robust economic prediction. It wasn't just a figure someone pulled out of the air, So, and I'm not saying there's no, tax evasion or whatever in the UK. Of course there is, but not to that extent. So there's multiple things that would need to come together rather than just blockchain as a whole. Yeah, I
think it will contribute to kind of safer ways of doing certain things, but for a wider adoption, it might take a while. Amazing. Okay, well, a serious question, super serious. I can't imagine myself answering it. yet. But not in 5 years' time. Okay, so you're 40 years old, you're waking up, you realize you need to sort your shit out. Get one unencumbered property you live in as your main residence worth 300K. Would you start a portfolio of buy-to-lets?
I'm assuming there are certain things that remain as they are that aren't stipulated here. So we're still in 2022. We're operating in the marketplaces that we are now. There's all of the legislation and compliance issues still in place. This isn't like it's not like me and Piotr having to fast forward 5 years and Adam and Ross, growing younger by some small degree. A year or two each, and they're back to 40.
I bet Helen's glad she's not here for this question.
Okay, yeah, well, no, leave Helen alone. What's wrong with you? She'll have to jump forward the same way as me and Piotr. Now, that's how you keep friends. But yeah, no, I think that's an interesting one, Matt. I think that's very interesting. I think if you're smart, you would maybe you do some property, but you'd also look at other investments. You want to try and create a stable platform for you to kind of maintain whatever wealth it is you have at the time that you have it. Wealth creation is easy, but it's easier to lose it intergenerationally than it is to create it in the first place. Some of the problems that the most wealthy people have is that they're hedonistic or drug-addled children or grandchildren don't blow through the family inheritance, and it could be gambling. There was some aristocracy, some British aristocracy, and all it took
Prince Andrew. Do you mean?
Well, yeah. Well, even before then, a couple hundred years ago, all they needed was one gambling, drug-addicted pisshead to completely, ruin, like get kicked out of court, family homes taken by another family, like all of that kind of stuff. So I think you need to make things stable, and I think the aristocracy that's done exceedingly very well with that. We don't have to think too far back to the young aristocrat who inherited his father's wealth and paid not a jot for it. Because it was set up and it's divided and designed that he can't blow it, and neither can his son's children's children. And I think it isn't all just in real estate. I mean, a lot of people would think it is, but actually it's not. A lot of it is in infrastructure, and it's invested on a global platform.
So what would you do today? 300K right now.
What would I do?
Well,
I would buy maybe 4 or 5 buy-to-lets in the northeast or the northwest. Pray to any deity that would listen that the tenants don't completely destroy the place and rip all the copper piping out, and then leave me destitute. But then the rest of it, I would invest in other things. I think, and I like probably things that people would consider silly, but and not all of it would be on a cryptocurrency or the blockchain, although I probably would put maybe 50K of it in there, because I think if you're going to buy it to hold it, either it's going to hit zero and you lost what you put in, or it's going to moonshot and you can retire, right? There's not much more that can happen than that. Whereas in true gambling, you can put money in and you can lose more than you put in, in certain strategies. So I would do things like that.
I think you've got a great opportunity at the moment to get some really cheap debt against your own residential property, like between 1% and 2%. Let's say you pulled a couple of $100,000 out of it. You've only got to beat 2 to 4K a year in terms of where the debt drag is in order to be able to show a positive return. So I think I always would recommend people invest in stuff that they're interested in, because if you're not interested in it, then you're going to make bad decisions. You're not going to be informed. It's not worth doing that. So you've got to accept the premise behind what Jay says around how active you're talking about. Active property investment. Now, you can be relatively passive within the active space, but you've still got decisions to make if the tenant does rip out all the copper piping and all the rest of it, like Jay said. you're still exposed to the regulatory and legislative environment. You can invest in REITs and stuff like that and get some property exposure in a much more passive way and generate an income that way that might be, nearly guaranteed to pay the mortgage every month, every year that you on the debt that you take out. Me personally, if you want to, where have I been able to create wealth through property? By buying it below value, by adding value through refurbishment. It's quite hard to make those lumps of leveraged money work quite that hard for you in another way, unless you've got very good steer on publicly traded companies or, are privy to information that the rest of us would very much like to have. It's rather difficult to do anything more than the market will do, which on average over the years is about 7% over time. So still not the worst idea in the world compared to paying 2% on the debt necessarily. So how much time have you got? How much passion have you got? That's what it boils down to, doesn't it really? Time, money, motivation, and the confluence of those three parts of the Venn diagram. You've got to put yourself in one of those intersections or the middle, or, and have an honest conversation with yourself about what you want and how you want to achieve those things. It's going to take a bit of effort, but you could, with relatively low risk, you could seriously improve your long-term financial position. And despite what some have said, at the very young age of 40, you still have a very long time ahead of you to enjoy the fruits of those labours, whatever you choose those labours to be.
Yeah, I agree. Like investing is the most important. Like you need to be interested in something, and if you're interested in something, kind of a way to possibly hedge against the risk is like follow what like some big money does, or what the government supports right now, like the sustainability, like the EPC ratings, like all those things where money are going to flow at some point because of legislation. So probably those things are worth considering. But yeah, we passed our 11 o'clock thing. We've been going strong today. Very impressive.
I think I've covered my 84% contractor requirement today quite well.
You did.
Sorry about that.
No, it's been super informational. I mean, I loved the discussion, and it feels like a bit of a practical university lecture where everything is applicable. We can go away now and use it. So
that's the key. That's the key, Piotr. So thank you.
And for everybody that's listening, please vote for Adam in the next election.
I'm a heavyweight politician for the wrong reasons, Ross. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You've been working on that for a while, I know.
Adam, before we go, if you were to go, what colour would you be? Well, where would you pin your masts on the political left-right spectrum?
I couldn't see myself having a happy home in the Labour Party with the makeup of the party since Corbyn first came in, really. So Angela Rayner would want to hang me from a yardarm, wouldn't she? So I think I'd have no choice but to go blue. Realistically, I'd have no choice.
Yeah, I think so.
Brilliant. Well,
good. We'll still vote for you.
Yeah.
If you guys want to continue this conversation, Partners in Properties in London on Friday, right?
It certainly is.
Yeah,
I shall be there. Looking forward to it very much.
Yes.
Got a couple of amazing speakers. We've got Kwesi, who is always just wonderful to speak to on every level. And I'm quite excited. We've got Michael Dent, who tech entrepreneur, property data founder, also involved in What 3 Words. He was co-founder of What 3 Words, which is quite a cool company. For those who haven't heard of it, look it up. It's pretty clever. And he also, his hobby project is a project called betdata.io about politics betting. So I shall be chewing his ear off for approximately 4 hours after the event, I'd imagine.
Wow, that is quite a resume.
It really is. It really is. So I hope to see as many people there as possible. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Amazing. Okay, well, we might also be there. I'm back in London now, so we might make our way there somehow.
It'd be great to see you, mate. Great to see you.
It's only once in a while I could do it, so I don't want to miss that opportunity.
Good man.
We've got to give you a drink. you know, we've got to pay homage while you're in the south. We've got to give you a tickle of something nice. So yeah, it'll be good to see you.
Excellent.
Amazing, really good. Okay, well, see you all guys next week for another informational chat.
Take it easy.
See you
Have a
later.
great week, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.